Ultimately, you need to be able to do both. You need to have the capacity to scream or breathe depending on what's appropriate for the current situation. I've picked out 10 books from my library from 10 different approaches to somatic therapy, and it might be troubling to hear, but there really is no answer for mastering your emotional complexity and really developing an ability to self-regulate or self-express, to be able to cathartically scream and purge and let out your anger when you disagree with something, or alternatively, be able to know when it's time for containment and down-regulation, because not every emotion is high quality. In fact, there can be some really low-grade trigger finger responses which are near worthless and near meaningless, or maybe at a deeper level, it's actually just a repetition of an unresolved trauma from the past. In this video, I'm going to teach you a principle regarding self-regulation rather than any actual practices, because we're looking at the whole spectrum of emotion. I want you to have the capacity to cathartically express, whether it be a warm, angry feeling, whether it be anger frothing from your mouth rather than suffocating and choking it down, or if it's tears streaming down your cheeks, if it's that cold, heavy, collapsed emotion. Catharsis can be warm and outwards. It can also be dropping downwards and be the release of sadness. You can likewise learn how to downregulate. You can likewise learn how to do breathwork practices and go into meditative visionary experiences and learn how to calm yourself down and be like the Zen monk sat amidst the storm and not be affected by the world, but neither response should be followed all the way through. For the sake of entertainment, I'm going to show you the 10 books I picked out more or less at random from my shelves over there on somatic therapy. Of course, starting at the beginner of the rabbit hole with the book that everyone likes to refer to, but actually really isn't the book that you should go too deep into and think that you've learned everything you need to know about emotional complexity and self-regulation. I know the title is fantastic and it's become a bestseller. Bessel van der Kolk has done amazing work, but if you want to go deeper into the journey, you probably then end up with books like Peter Levine, In an Unspoken Voice. This is the next great step, and then maybe you want to start doing some bioenergetics with Alexander Lowen, a book like Depression and the Body, and then maybe you go into more old-school cathartic therapy, like The New Primal Scream with Dr. Arthur Janov, and maybe you want to keep going into mindfulness, and you look at books like Aligned, Relaxed, Resilient by Will Johnson, or going into methods like Hakomi, Body-Centered Psychotherapy, or maybe going into Core Energetics by John Pierrakos, or you keep going down that rabbit hole back into the 50s and the 60s, some old school Alexander technique, or you want to get a bit more spiritual, a bit more humanistic. How about John Rowan, Ordinary Ecstasy and the Dialectics of Humanistic Psychology, or just go all the way into your energy systems and the link between the spiritual and the somatic with things like this, which show you, of course, how things like your hara line and your various chakras all influence your various emotional and muscular systems. There are so many different ways to work with emotions and work with trauma and work with the body and work with the interplay between the psyche and the soma. I introduced all of these books to give you possible resources for you to find in your own time, but also to try and answer this question, or a variation of this question that I receive every single week about repressed emotions, because the emotions that you experience depend on your life circumstance, both in the past, the present, and also your capacity to create new circumstances in the future. Every single therapist, every single teacher and somatic practitioner that I held up just there has a different approach towards emotional regulation. Some therapists, for example, John Rowan, I remember a particular extract in this book. He's a fantastic humanistic psychologist. He says that to downregulate a client's emotions in a moment of distress in the middle of a session is one of the most disvalidating and worst things you can do if you're really looking for them to be honest about their feelings. You should never encourage somebody to just take a breath and take it easy in the most extreme perspective, because what if you're disvalidating their real experience? Alternatively, what if someone needs to just express, they need to just cathartically let it all out? And we look at the primal scream modality, for example, with Arthur Janov. Again, I could bring this book out. I highly recommend you pick up this copy. It's fantastic. But really every book, all 10 of these books, 10 books out of dozens I could have brought out of, there's many different approaches. Some therapists say, never repress an emotion. Others would say that if you're spilling over and you're frothing and you've got lots of anger that's bubbling out in an uncontained and unstructured way, it's time for a bit of self-regulation skill. And yet at the same time, bit of a pet peeve moment, I've become thoroughly bored and disinterested in the cliche phrase of self-regulation or regulating your nervous system, because I know what the science is referring to, but the way that we're using that phrase is very, very lazy and often misleading and often preventing people from developing the right skill set at the higher bands of emotional intelligence because they don't understand the differences and the subtleties and the different gradations of emotion. And what I mean by that is that there are some emotions which are very low grade and some which are very high grade. Not every emotion is as true as another emotion. Not every feeling should be felt and listened to with the same degree of sincerity and seriousness. I'm not advocating for not listening to your emotions, but I am suggesting that not all emotions should get a seat at the head of the council of your decision making. Let me give you a few examples. When we're looking at this question of should I scream or should I breathe, should I cathartically express or should I bring myself back into center, let's take an example where you're in the work environment and your boss has said something which really rubs you the wrong way and you feel this righteous surge of intense volcanic energy and you would love nothing more than to chew his face off. Where did that come from? Would it be authentic and cathartic for you to say exactly what you mean in that moment? Probably, maybe. You'd also likely lose your job. There's a real limitation that should be put in place in the professional environment. That's established. We can agree on that. But what about later on? What about when you're in your therapy session or you're at the gym or in the forest and you've got the time to feel? What do you do then? Well, maybe you feel the intensity of the emotion and you feel the rage and the frustration and the indignation of being put down, shut down, or otherwise belittled by somebody who supposedly should be looking out for you. And it might be just your boss. It might be just their words in that moment, but if you're aware of holistic psychology overall and you've done some unconscious shadow work or gone into the Jungian therapy style approach towards things like the mother complex and the father complex, you usually get to a moment where you realize that actually there's a mommy issue or a daddy issue which is looping from the past and exaggerating or turning up the saturation on a very real feeling, but making it much bigger than it actually needs to be based on the situation alone. You are feeling it for real. You're feeling it on the inside, but the cathartic release outwards or the playing into the emotion in the immediate therapeutic session, either with yourself or with a therapeutic figure, isn't just about what's happening in the everyday. It's also looking back to the past. And whenever I've worked with people who have either significant anger issues, whether it be the repression of anger or the overflowing, bubbling anger, it's usually the case that we can go back into the mother complex and the father complex and realize that within most men and women, if we're being honest with ourselves, almost every single man and woman that I've ever spoken to at depth, everyone, I'm going to say everyone, I very much try and avoid generalizations. You can't get through life, you can't get through the first 18 years of being raised from baby to adult and not have a few points of grittiness, or maybe in a more extreme sense, points of outright hostility towards your mom or your dad. Maybe something they did, maybe something they didn't do, but then unless you take all of that dispersed energy and the placeholder masculine, feminine figures of your mother and father and realize it's about them and not all men or all women, and this is the very classic cliche, if he's got mommy issues or she's got daddy issues, we know it's not just about the people we're encountering in our day-to-day life. It goes back to our parents, just to name one example. It can also be previous relationships, it can also be previous employers, and it can be a variety of things that we see on the internet and their subconscious narratives which are bubbling around inside of us. Why does this relate to the question of breathing and screaming and self-regulation versus catharsis? You need to look at the idea of repression versus containment. Repressing an emotion isn't the same as containing an emotion. You contain the emotion of anger towards your boss in the work environment and you deal with it later in an appropriate way. Depends on which way is appropriate, depending on all the things that we just said, but that's containment. Repression is pretending it never happened and moving on with drink or television or otherwise just trying to avoid the feeling altogether. However, that's not the full picture. What if you could also be repressing your emotions, unintentionally repressing your emotions, by trying to go towards downregulation or catharsis? Crazy idea, right? Downregulating your emotion is actually repressing your emotion, even though you think that you're doing an intentional breathwork practice, or you're meditating through a visual resolution to giving love and kindness towards your boss in this example. Or alternatively, you're repressing your real emotion by being fixated or fascinated on a certain aspect of what your boss said, that certain level of anger, rather than the nuance of the rage and the fury, which relates to a much deeper issue from the past. You're repressing or otherwise avoiding unintentionally the real emotion beneath the triggered state at the top of the top layer, the surface layer. What about all these situations? It's impossible for me to give you a full solution in a video like this. What I'm trying to do is open up your perspective to the idea that not all emotions are to be fully expressed, and even when we think we're regulating an emotion via outwards bound, get it out, or inwards bound, calm it down, it might not be containment or processing, it could still be repression. What I want you to take with you as a final bit of advice, and again, you can go back in this video and take some of these books, is to have the ability to go in either direction depending on what's appropriate. You can be both sensitive and stoic. And it's a wonderful idea. You can be centered in your emotional intelligence and have the ability to use the skill of catharsis and use the skill of emotional self-regulation, let's call it. Again, the phrase itself is ambiguous, but you understand what I'm saying. Depending on what's appropriate, even as the emotion unfolds over multiple hours. Just the other day, you may have seen on the back of my hand here, I've got a bit of a blister mark because I had a lot of stress in my work environment. I went to the gym and the heavy bag was up and I was doing a few roundhouse kicks on the bag, a bit of a Muay Thai style workout, some elbows in as well. And I got a bit carried away and I didn't have any gloves, and my just kind of like finding the distance ended up being a bit rougher than I probably should have gone without gloves, and I scraped off some of the skin. My anger, my cathartic release was there and I really enjoyed that. I also had moments in the gym in the same session because no one was around, where I collapsed into a ball on the floor as I was resting between sessions, and I noticed the sadness. My anger and my sadness were both mixed in together. Of course, I'm not going to break down into tears in the gym, and it wasn't even a situation where I needed to break down into tears. But I still acknowledged the sadness. I acknowledged the degree of sadness that was present, with a wider degree of anger that was present based on specific work stress situations. And I let myself have just that heavy exhale, that heavy feeling, and then I pendulated back into more of an assertive, outwards bound cathartic expression. And guess what? Later in the evening, a few hours later, I had more meditative stillness as I was reflecting on my day, and it would be considered more of a classic Zen-like response of detachment and compassion towards the various things I was feeling and the various situations that I felt like I was responsible for and dealing with. There's so many ways to look at emotion, there's so many ways to understand the gradation of emotion from low quality to high quality, ambiguous as that might be, but hopefully you've got an intuition for what I'm talking about, and work through the various stages depending on what's appropriate. Have the skill to be able to scream. Have the skill to be able to breathe. Be able to do both of those at the various levels of emotional consciousness, and you will be in such a wonderful place to master your emotional complexity, and you won't need to really go down a path of too much of doing one or doing the other. And if you want a final takeaway, just a really practical bit of advice to end this video. If you tend to go aggressively one way or aggressively the other way, either you're always cathartic or you're always self-regulating and breathing and being meditative, it's usually a good indication that you've got a hell of a lot of growth potential if you just try doing the opposite skill. If you're usually screaming, try being calm. If you're usually calm, try a bit of screaming. Overly simplified, but I hope that helps, and I'll see you over on the next video, which you can find over here, and we'll talk about a bit more catharsis and emotional expression.